James chapter 1 verses 2 till 8. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. If any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. But when he asks, he must believe and not doubt, because he who doubts is like a wave of a sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That man should not think he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all he does. Proverbs chapter 1 verses 1 to 7. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for attaining wisdom and discipline, for understanding words of insight, for acquiring a disciplined and prudent life, doing what is right and just and fair, for giving prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. For understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline.
We read from the opening chapter of the book of James, and in that chapter James writes these words. He says, "If any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God." If any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God. As I read this, I asked myself the question, what is wisdom? What is wisdom? I asked the question because if I don't know what wisdom is, then how do I know whether I've got it or not? So if anyone lacks wisdom, they should ask God. Well, if you want an answer to that question, first of all, you need to know what wisdom is, and then you can examine yourself as to whether or not you've got any of it. And these first 7 verses of the book of Proverbs go some way to answering that question. The book of Proverbs is a very practical book, and many of its sayings are self-evident and leave little for the preacher to say. That's one of the reasons that you don't hear many sermons preached on the book of Proverbs, because once you've read the Proverbs, there isn't a lot more to say about it, and sermons would be very short. But as I said, the book of Proverbs is very practical. And verse 2 of chapter 1 leads us straight to that conclusion. Verse 2 reads, "For attaining wisdom and discipline, for understanding words of insight." It's a practical book, is the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs was written for those people who want to attain wisdom and discipline. And take note that the wisdom that the writer speaks about is not some kind of academic wisdom. It's not something that you have to go to university to acquire. It's not the kind of wisdom that is exchanged in great theological or philosophical debates. You will not find it confined to big books and academic papers. The wisdom that the writer speaks about is a God-given gift. You get it, according to James, by prayerfully asking God for it. The wisdom of the Proverbs is practical, not academic. It's there to help us lead disciplined lives. That's lives of disciples. And verse 2 links these ideas together, discipline and wisdom. The book is to be read by those who want to attain those two things, wisdom and discipline. The wisdom that is talked about is practical. It is the wisdom that leads us to changing the way we live and the way that we speak. Which gets me back to my original question. How do I know if I have wisdom? And the answer is to look at some of the characteristics of a life disciplined by God's wisdom and to ask ourselves whether or not our lives display that kind of wisdom. We're given in this introductory passage of Proverbs at least 6 characteristics of a life lived in God's given wisdom. But I'm wise enough to not try and preach a 6-point sermon this morning, and I will just stick to 3 of the characteristics, and you can do the rest of the work yourself. The first point is in the second part of verse 2. For understanding words of insight. Well, one of the answers to that question is the words of this book. Not just the Proverbs, but the whole Bible. It is understanding what it has to say and putting it into practice. Jesus says this in the parable of the wise and foolish builders. The wise man says Jesus is the one who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice. It's the person who puts them into practice who is like a wise man who built his house upon the rock. It's not just the hearing of the words, it's the putting the words into practice. Understanding words of insight goes further than this. It includes the ability to discern the right from the wrong in the advice that people offer us. Understanding words of insight includes how you listen to the preacher. We must do it critically. We need to be clear that the object of the sermon is not to hear the preacher, but to hear the voice of God speaking to us through the preacher. And I have, over the last 40 years of my Christian life, listened to many sermons. Technically, most were good and some were awful. And over the last 40 years, I have preached more than my share of the awful ones. But that's not the question. The question is, have we heard the voice of God? And if we have, what did we do with it? Recently, I sat through a rather long sermon in which the preacher tried to cram enough information to fill at least a month's worth of my own sermons. I thought it was a terrible waste of good material. Because of this, I was in danger of missing the voice of God. But sometimes God shouts, and I had to come down from my technical criticism and listen to what God was actually saying to me. And that's the real question. For every Sunday, as the preacher stands there saying something, the question that each of us need to be asking is, what is God saying to me? What is the relevance of this to me today? And the first practical point about wisdom is that it is the God-given ability to understand words of insight. But accompanying the insight is the power of God to put the understanding into practice. It's no good as understanding and listening to what God has got to say to us if our intention is to walk away at the end of the sermon and do nothing at all with it and take no notice whatsoever of what God has been saying to us. Wisdom and discipline go together. The second point about wisdom that you find in this passage is that it is about our ability to receive instruction and to put that instruction into practice by doing what is right, just and fair. It's not just about knowing the difference between right and wrong. Wisdom is about choosing to do the right rather than the wrong. And that's an important part of this idea of wisdom that you get in Proverbs. Part of wisdom is the ability to discern between that which is right and that which is wrong. And you would think that this is common to everybody rather than just the people who are seeking God's wisdom. You know, the idea that in some ways this is common sense, although I don't believe in common sense. If it was common, then everybody would do the things that I do. It's not common at all. Sense is something that you have to look for in people. And this idea of discerning the right from the wrong is the same idea, that you need God's wisdom to know that which is right and that which is wrong. And it's a day-to-day practical thing in our lives about how we make choices. Do we actually seek to be making the right choice all the time, or are we sometimes simply reacting to the circumstances and then thinking to ourselves afterwards, it may have been better if I did it a different way? Do you have that experience on occasions? I usually have it when I'm driving a car and somebody does something which annoys me. They're usually doing something dangerous, but sometimes it's just something that annoys me. And I react to this, and then afterwards I think to myself, was that the right way of dealing with this situation, or did I just react to it? And the book of Proverbs is telling us about the characteristics about what the wisdom of God looks like. And part of the wisdom of God is knowing that which is right and that which is wrong, and having the ability to do that which is right, to make the right decisions. And when you try and apply that practically to your life in the everyday little details, you suddenly become aware of the fact that maybe James is right when he says, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously. Because there are those occasions for all of us when we simply react rather than doing the right thing. Thirdly, in verse 4, we're told that wisdom gives prudence to the simple. We need to unpick these words a little. The simple that is being talked about is not those who are slow of understanding. The simple are those who are inexperienced and naive. The prudence that is talked about is what we might call shrewdness. In the words of Jesus, be wise as serpents and as innocent as doves. I used to work for Langley House Trust, an organisation that you as a church have some connections with. And working with people coming out of prison, with people who have offended, often serious offenders, has its dangers attached to it. And one of the sayings of my boss when I worked for Langley House Trust was, God save us from well-meaning Christians. Those people who actually had all the right intentions, who came and helped as volunteers and things, very welcomed, but not always exercising the kind of shrewdness and wisdom that was required under the circumstances. And not because they didn't understand or were too simple to understand, but simply out of the goodness of their hearts, a kind of a naivety. And what the book of Proverbs is saying is not that that kind of naive purity is wrong, but that we need to learn a little wisdom in the way that we react to people. So there's three characteristics of the wisdom. One is to help us, to give us insight into the words of God. Two, it's to help us choose that which is right from that which is wrong. And thirdly, it's this idea of, yes, we maintain our innocence, being innocent as doves, but within that, having the wisdom of the serpent, a shrewdness about us. The question at the beginning was, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God. Well, it's now up to you to actually kind of examine yourselves and look at it and say, is this how my life looks like? Am I wise in these things of God? And if not, then to seek God's wisdom prayerfully Before I close, though, let me say one more thing. Wisdom does not always come with age. Just a warning there. Wisdom does not always come with age. The advice that you get from older people is not always the right advice. And simply living a long life does not necessarily make you any wiser than you were at the beginning. Wisdom does not necessarily come with age. Nor is it something that is ever complete in this life. Verse 5 says, "Let the wise listen and add to their learning." So you might be getting on a bit in years and you might think that you know it all already, but the truth is that you don't, and even the wise need to add to their learning. This is especially, I think, a message for teenagers, because I've come to the conclusion that teenagers ought to be allowed to rule the world because they know everything already. But just in case you don't, it says, let the wise listen and add to their learning. You may have taken the three indicators that I've expounded and said to yourself, yes, I understand the words of insight. Yes, I know the difference between right and wrong and act with justice and fairness. You may think that you have learnt Christian shrewdness, and you may be right. Praise God for his gift of wisdom. But don't think it's complete. We can always add to our learning and our humility. And the next time that you fail to hear the voice of God through the preacher, the next time you pick up your Bible and get nothing from it, remember that God gives generously and he will give wisdom to those who seek it. The next time that you're not sure what is the right way, or the next time that you are sure what was the right way and you haven't taken it, remember that God gives generously and he will give wisdom to those who seek it. The next time that you are taken in, that you are succored by someone's story, remember that God gives generously and he will give wisdom to those who seek it. James is a very practical letter, just as Proverbs is a very practical book. James is saying to people, there is a wisdom that comes from God, and if you want it, simply ask God for it. Proverbs tells us a little bit about what that wisdom looks like. What we need to do is look at our lives and ask whether or not we're leading them in this wisdom of God, or whether we need to seek a bit more of it than we already have. May God speak to us individually, that we may become wise in the things of him. Amen.